A few times recently, I have seen comments from people disappointed at the purported lack of OLED on the Switch 2. And while we will doubtless find out more in April, I have seen people already feeling inclined to wait for an OLED console revision. Given that it took Switch more than 4.5 years to receive such a revision, I couldn't wait that long personally, but you have to wonder why. Given how massive an improvement Switch 2 appears to be over its predecessor, they appear to have dropped the ball in one of the most high-profile evolutions of the original Switch. After all, Nintendo's mid-gen refreshes tend to be mileposts towards the features of their new consoles, whether it be the color in the Game Boy Color, the additional camera in the DSi, or embedding shoulder buttons and a second analog stick in the new 3DS. And this makes sense because while Nintendo likes to innovate, they are also incredibly long-termist. Shinya Takahashi's gag that the GameCube handle was a step towards portable gaming might have been tongue-in-cheek at the January 2017 conference, but let's face it, it's not that far from the truth. The general manager of Nintendo's technology development divisions, Ko Shiota, explained in 2021, because the product life cycle of game consoles is relatively long, and we continue to offer products with these same functions, I think this culture of improvement has taken root in us. Even while developing the AV Famicom, we continued to use the basic parts of the Famicom, but we adopted the new technologies and ideas at that time and improved on things like adding the AV port, making the console smaller, and making the controller more comfortable to hold. Rather curiously, in this same developer interview for the launch of the Switch OLED, the question, "What motivated you to develop the Nintendo Switch OLED model?" does not prompt any reference to the OLED technology at all. And it's only when the interviewers drill down into the visuals specifically that Nintendo give this explanation, which, even then, seems to run away from fully embracing the OLED technology. Toru Yamashita explained, "The development of this model was not actually decided solely based on adopting the OLED display, even though this is the most distinctive feature of this model. The OLED display technology itself existed in the Nintendo 3DS era, and we were continuously investigating its technological trends, but it did not quite match with our conditions, and it was never adopted for Nintendo game consoles. However, the number of products equipped with OLED displays is increasing around the world, and the technology has been improving. So upon verifying and reinvestigating with our partner companies on what conditions were possible for what we needed for our game console, we determined it was the right time for us to adopt the technology." In retrospect, I find their focus on OLED rather tentative, and this does make sense because Nintendo doesn't tend to mainline on technical details, but rather the experience provided, and yet the model title goes by OLED model. I guess in this case they probably felt that any other label risked confusion, something they'd clearly been concerned about since the Wii U singularly failed to convey anything about the product. The system couldn't be described as XL since it was the same physical size, and wired LAN devices were hardly going to hold appeal to the majority of players. It seems that a major driver of adopting OLED was actually that this was the best technology they could use to pursue a bezel-free Switch alternative, given that OLED displays are thinner and more flexible. Now, presumably, they have managed to achieve the same with LCD. My hunch is that at this point they may well have known that OLED was not likely to feature in their long-term plans, but the revision had been designed around OLED, and so they had no choice but to go with it while promoting lots of other features besides. If, as was widely speculated, there was an intention to create a pro revision, then the OLED branding would never have become quite so prominent as it ended up becoming. Of course, this prompts the question of why Nintendo would abandon the technology, and this seems to come down to price. After all, while there are advantages to LEDs such as brightness and more resilience against burn-in, though tests with the OLED over thousands of hours never turned up any major problems, the major benefit of LED seems to be price, and it's clear from Furukawa's recent statement that price has been a major concern of theirs in terms of creating a new Switch. Switching to OLED might also have helped Nintendo achieve a longer battery life, something which has an almost talismanic importance for Nintendo, given how the long battery life of the Game Boy helped Nintendo dominate the 90s handheld war against the Sega Game Gear. Whether they can make similar battery savings with an LED model remains to be seen, which prompts the question, will OLED ever return? While it's tempting to imagine that the Switch 2 will follow the footsteps of the original Switch with a light model, I'm less sure that an OLED revision is as safe a bet. After all, a mid-gen revision to produce a higher price model requires something to justify a substantial price increase, but as we've heard from Furukawa for years, OLED actually had smaller margins than the other models, and it's quite conceivable that they decided the additional cost was more of a drag than a benefit. If the next high-end model is released not in the middle of a pandemic, but at a time when Nintendo has more leeway to innovate in different ways, they could bypass OLED entirely, hoping to rely on other technological improvements for any visual glow-ups they might wish to show. It could even come down to more prosaic factors closer to the time. If the exchange rate and the economic backdrop are unfavorable at the time, they may feel it better to cut costs by sticking with LED, whereas if things are more favorable, they may feel that they can impress more with an OLED display. Still, it has to be said that visual technology is not really Nintendo's bag, and I don't know that I expect them to keep returning to this well so often. However, this assumes that they are not only attracted to OLED for its most conspicuous features, the improved visuals, but Nintendo will continue to Nintendo, and OLED is a technology that they will continue to research, I have no doubt. Transparent and folding displays frequently seem to be OLED based as well, and while it's not obvious to me that Nintendo will find a benefit in this technology currently, if they develop some new initiative for exciting gameplay, then we could well see an OLED return. There is even talk about OLED technology being used as part of wearable technology. The thing is, Nintendo monitors lots of different technologies, but they don't generally like to make their big move until the technology is well established and cheaper in price. OLED at present is becoming more standard, but the price doesn't seem to have matched. It's far too early to make a forecast about a mid-generation console revision that might not even be released in this decade, but I would not necessarily assume that OLED will become a standard feature of Nintendo consoles going forward, and it's quite possible that the OLED model could be the last for some time. Thank you to the channel's Patreon subscribers. Thank you so much for watching, liking, sharing, commenting, and subscribing, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.